Hey everyone, welcome to the show.
Great to be diving into this one.
Absolutely. Can you imagine a regime seemingly rock solid, built on this incredible force of personality, and let's face it, military power,
For making.
suddenly just teetering, right on the edge of collapse the moment its leader dies?
It's a classic historical pressure point, isn't it?
Yeah.
That moment of transition.
Exactly. And today, we're diving right into that kind of historical drama, a moment where the unexpected death of a towering figure really unleashed this whirlwind of ambition, fear, and just this desperate scramble for order.
We're talking about the death of Oliver Cromwell, of course,
Yeah.
and the chaotic period that followed.
Precisely. This deep dive looks at that pivotal time in English history, post-Civil War, heading towards the Restoration. It's a thrilling glimpse into the raw dynamics of power.
The fragility beneath the surface.
Totally. So if you're fascinated by those moments where history just hangs in the balance, and if you want to uncover some surprising insights into how societies cope when leadership vanishes.
Or appears to vanish.
Good point. Then be sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives like this one.
We'll be using Henry Reece's book, The Fall, as a key guide here. It meticulously details the events after Cromwell's death.
That's right. The Fall, link is in the description if you wanted to check it out on Amazon. Prepare yourselves because you're going to see how quickly even the strongest authority can dissolve.
And how unexpected people step up, or try to.
And how that deep, deep desire for just some kind of stability ultimately shapes a nation's future.
It kicks off, fascinatingly, with this almost surreal quiet right after Oliver Cromwell dies. That's September 3rd, 1658.
Okay.
His son, Richard, is proclaimed protector in London the very next morning, September 4th. Very formal, very official.
So it looks smooth on the surface.
Remarkably so. The Privy Council managed this transition within about 18 hours,
Ooh.
which is pretty quick.
Considering what?
Well, there's no clear hereditary succession principle here, not like a monarchy. And crucially, there wasn't definitive written proof that Oliver had actually nominated Richard under the terms of the humble petition and advice, the sort of constitution of the time.
Ah, okay. So the legal basis was maybe a bit shaky, or at least not explicitly documented right then?
Potentially, yes. Yet, outwardly, it's calm.
So let's unpack that calm. Because as you hinted, and as Reece points out, underneath that quiet surface, there were huge anxieties beforehand about what would happen when Oliver died.
Absolutely massive anxieties. You have figures like Thomas Fairfax noting the huge significance of the change, but also commenting on the quietness, as if nothing had really happened.
Strange.
And John Tillotson, writing from London, reported this deep sense of peace. People just didn't seem to notice any alteration.
Which is just bizarre, given Cromwell's dominance, right? So what's going on? Is this genuine acceptance of Richard, or is it something else? Relief, maybe?
I think relief is a big part of it, that initial calm. It probably wasn't deep-seated acceptance of Richard himself, more like everyone collectively holding their breath, relieved the immediate chaos hadn't erupted.
Because the fear of chaos was real.
Oh, absolutely. 6 months before Oliver died, someone wrote, urging him to name a successor precisely to stop a chaos of confusion. John Thurlow, Cromwell's intelligence chief, a key insider.
Right.
He sensed general consternation at the prospect of Oliver's death. He feared our own divisions far more than, say, a royalist comeback.
Interesting. Internal collapse was the bigger worry.
Exactly. Sir Archibald Johnston noted the great apprehensions before Oliver died, contrasting sharply with the lack of obvious grief or fear immediately after. Richard Baxter recalled Richard being quietly settled, even though many expected total confusion and discord.
So the expectation was meltdown.
Pretty much. George Downing called it a most surprising, astonishing mercy that things went so smoothly, because many thought Oliver's death would open a wide door for Charles Stuart, the exiled king.
Okay, so the key insight here is that contrast. The expected chaos versus the immediate, almost unsettling order.
Precisely. It tells you a lot about the underlying fragility and fear beneath the Protectorate's surface. That apparent ease reveals how the political nation, the people with influence, viewed the regime at that specific moment.
So was it just relief, or was there some level of genuine buy-in to the Protectorate continuing, even under Richard?
It's complex. There was probably a degree of pragmatic acceptance among some. They'd lived through immense upheaval.
Civil wars, regime change.
Exactly. Stability was likely the top priority for many, and Richard, initially at least, seemed to offer continuation. Plus, the government machinery, the Privy Council, acted quickly and decisively. That likely shut down any immediate challenges.
And there wasn't a clear alternative ready to step in.
Not one that commanded universal support, no. That definitely helped Richard in those first hours and days.
Okay, but then it gets even more interesting because it wasn't just quiet acceptance. We see this flood almost of addresses and petitions coming in publicly backing Richard.
Yes, a very public display of endorsement. And many of these declarations really hammered home the idea that Oliver himself had nominated Richard.
Ah, so emphasizing legitimacy through Oliver's will.
Right. They praised Richard's sweet and peaceable entrance. Some even used that biblical analogy, Richard, as Joshua taking over from Oliver's Moses.
Powerful imagery.
And they constantly cited the humble petition and advice as the legal basis for his succeeding his father. The address from the East Riding of Yorkshire was apparently particularly over the top in its praise.
Okay, but here's the kicker. Was this genuine popular support bubbling up?
Yeah.
Because Reece points out the Army Command was actually circulating templates for these addresses.
Bingo. That certainly suggests, well, orchestration, doesn't it?
It really does. A bit stage managed.
The Army's hand is undeniable. The fact that civilian documents often use the exact same phrasing as the Army templates, that's more than coincidence. But it's not just the Army. Provincial elites saw an opportunity here, too. They had their own reasons to publicly back the new guy.
Like what? Local interests?
Absolutely. Exeter, for example, might have wanted to show they were cooperative now. Newcastle probably wanted to soothe worries about royalist sympathies in their area. York put on a big show to emphasize its own regional importance.
So demonstrating loyalty, managing perceptions.
And proven they could hold large gatherings without things getting out of hand. That was important too. So it's a mix. Some genuine support, perhaps, some calculated self-interest, definitely some military pressure.
And maybe not always deep enthusiasm, even when an address was sent. The example of Great Yarmouth is telling, right? Slow to endorse Richard, quick to back Charles II later.
Exactly. Allegiances were very fluid. It highlights the performative nature of much of this support.
Right, a calculated performance. Now let's talk about Richard himself. He wasn't exactly groomed for this, was he? Not like his father trained him up.
That's a really crucial point. Richard was 40 when he took over, so not some kid. He was apparently quite personable, easy manner, could give a decent speech.
Okay, some skills.
And he had been increasingly involved in public life from the mid-1650s. He got onto the Privy Council in December 1657.
So some exposure.
Yes, but those persistent rumors about him maybe heading the government in Scotland, they never happened. It hints maybe Oliver or others were hesitant to give him real executive power.
Interesting.
And the historian Henry Hallam made a really sharp observation. He contrasted Oliver's apparent lack of effort in preparing Richard for the top job with the very deliberate way he did prepare his other son, Henry, for his role running Ireland.
So Henry got the real training Richard got?
Well, he was Chancellor of Oxford University.
I guess so.
Prestigious, yes.
Yeah.
But hardly an apprenticeship for Lord Protector of three nations in turmoil.
Not quite the same skill set needed. So we have this guy, pleasant enough, some public profile, but lacking deep political and military experience, stepping into his father's massive shoes.
And stepping into a situation dominated by the army. You simply can't talk about this period without focusing on the army.
Which had been Oliver's power base, but also a source of trouble for him, and clearly remained a potential problem for Richard.
Absolutely. We know the Protectorate collapses in April 1659. And the army is key to that. So it's easy to look back and see the army as Richard's opponent from day one.
But it was more complex.
Oh, yes. Tension between the Lord General Cromwell, then Richard, and senior officers was baked into the new model army from way back, at least 1647. Oliver himself had cashiered plenty of senior officers over the years. It wasn't some monolithic, obedient tool.
It was politicized.
Highly politicized.
Yeah.
With its own ideas, its own grievances, and one long-held belief within the Army Command was about keeping a really large officer corps, more than strictly needed.
Why? What was the logic there?
Well, the official line was it made the Army easier to manage in peacetime, and it meant you had experienced guys ready to step up if needed. Quick promotion.
Makes some sense.
But Henry Cromwell, Richard's brother in Ireland, he called it an expensive passion. He basically said it was about preserving jobs and patronage for the boys, a mix of military logic and self-interest, probably.
An expensive passion, especially when the state was already struggling financially.
Precisely. And that situation got massively worse because of Oliver's foreign policy, specifically the war with Spain.
Ah, yes. Started in 1655.
The Protectorate probably could have afforded its armies without foreign wars. But the Spanish War blew spending sky high.
How so?
Huge increase in naval costs, obviously. Then there was the cost of garrisoning new territories like Jamaica and Dunkirk. The estimates Reece cites suggest it added maybe £500,000 to £600,000 a year to the budget, a colossal sum back then.
Wow. And that hit hard.
By April 1659, the cost of the Navy in these overseas garrisons was actually more than the cost of the armies in England, Scotland, and Ireland combined.
Incredible. So by the time Richard takes over, the financial situation, especially for the Navy, must have been desperate.
Absolutely dire. The Admiralty Commissioners themselves reported in September 1658, just as Richard is becoming protector, that the Navy was on the brink of ruin.
Why? What happened?
Suppliers had lost confidence. They weren't getting paid. So they started demanding cash up front, which the government didn't have.
A classic debt spiral.
And a big reason for this collapse was successive cuts to the monthly assessment tax levied on England. That tax was vital.
Right, the assessment tax, that seems key to the whole financial picture of the Interregnum. Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. The government had three main income sources: customs duties, excise taxes, and this assessment tax. Customs and excise were fairly predictable, but they had natural limits.
You can only tax trade so much.
Exactly. The assessment tax, though, was the big variable. It was levied monthly on England, and the rate could be changed. Any changes had huge implications for how much military force the government could afford.
So Cromwell knew cutting it would hurt.
Oh, he understood the impact perfectly. But the tax was unpopular, politically sensitive. Still, its big attraction was efficiency. Low admin costs, people generally paid promptly. Non-payment wasn't a massive issue. Samuel Pepys later recorded Robert Blackburn, a key financial administrator, talking about how efficiently it was collected.
But it was still a heavy burden.
A very significant burden, especially compared to pre-war taxation levels.
Yeah.
Reece gives an example from Hythe, showing just how much it had increased.
Okay, so Richard inherits this situation. Shaky legitimacy, a politicized army with its own demands, and absolutely dire finances worsened by war. Not exactly an easy start.
Not at all. And then, amidst all this, you get this really unexpected twist. Significant support for Richard coming from the political Presbyterians in the 1659 Parliament.
To Presbyterians, weren't they often opponents of Cromwell? Excluded, purged?
Many of them were, yes. That's what's so remarkable. Guys who'd been kicked out during Pride's Purge in 1628, who'd opposed Cromwell in the 1654 Parliament, barred from the 1656 one. Suddenly, in 1659, they're defending Richard's Protectorate.
Wow. Who are we talking about?
Figures like Colonel John Birch, John Maynard, Samuel Gott, John Swinfen, men with serious political weight. And they weren't just passive supporters. They actively managed debates for Richard, arguing for the humble petition and advice.
Why this sudden change of heart? What was their motivation?
It seems overwhelmingly pragmatic. They feared the alternatives, total chaos or worse, direct military rule by the army radicals.
So Richard was the lesser evil, a bulwark against the army.
Essentially, yes. They focused on what Reece calls the negative virtues of the humble petition, basically. The fact that it hadn't been imposed directly by the army. It represented for them a civilian constitution, however flawed.
A kind of pragmatic constitutionalism.
Exactly. And their leadership was effective, at least initially. They managed to bed in this civilian structure, and the Republican opposition in Parliament couldn't win key votes against them. So Charles Coote reported things becoming more serene, with a possible path to a stable settlement.
Fascinating. A temporary alliance of convenience, driven by fear of the army. But the army wasn't just going to sit quietly, were they? They issued this humble representation.
Right. April 6, 1659. This wasn't humble at all, really. It was a very strongly worded reminder to Richard and Parliament about the army's grievances.
Hate and indemnity again.
Top of the list. Pay arrears and legal protection for things they'd done during the wars. They said they were breaking cover due to imminent dangers and necessities.
Strong language.
And significantly, they gave it to Richard on the 6th and had it printed and out on the streets the next morning. A very public power play.
What was their goal? What do they want Parliament to do?
They wanted Parliament to stop debating constitutional niceties and focus on their needs, pay, indemnity, national security, practical stuff. But Parliament had other priorities.
And Parliament wasn't exactly thrilled by this, I imagine, that anti-military feeling.
It just exploded. Once you had a full House sitting, that resentment found its voice. MPs saw the army acting like a fourth estate, basically another branch of government, interfering with impudence.
The army meeting separately didn't help either.
Not at all. That weakened Parliament's reputation.
Okay.
Richard did meet senior officers, told them their petition was being considered, and they should go back to their commands because MPs were unhappy and, the Cavalier threat was always there.
How did that go down?
Apparently, there were some pretty bad-tempered exchanges. The gap between them was widening rapidly.
And looking back, it seems Richard's handling of this whole escalating crisis between Parliament and the army was, well, clumsy.
Clumsy is one word. Ineffective, maybe? Hindsight is easy, of course, but Reece suggests that earlier, more decisive action might have made a difference. Letting the Army's General Council meet while also letting the Commons behave provocatively just infuriated the Army.
So he alienated both sides.
He seemed unable to control either. And when he finally did take a drastic stand, dissolving Parliament on April 18th, Reece argues it was based on really misguided advice.
Misguided how?
His advisors seem to have massively overestimated how much actual support Richard had within the army itself. People like Nehemiah Bourne were scornful, saying the Protector had no real pull with the soldiers. Lady Ranelagh was scathing. She said Richard provoked the army based on false promises from flatterers.
And the core issue was Richard himself just didn't command that personal loyalty his father had.
It seems not. There might have been some initial encouraging noises. Maybe Richard hinted he'd back the army against Parliament over his role as Generalissimo.
But it didn't translate into real support when push came to shove?
Apparently not. Any chance of reconciliation probably evaporated completely with that parliamentary debate on April 21st, the one about who controls the militia.
Ah, yes. That must have hit a nerve with the army, control of the armed forces.
Absolutely fundamental. For Parliament to even debate taking control of the militia away from the Protector and the existing army structure, it was seen as the ultimate provocation, a direct challenge.
Betrayal, even.
That's how the army saw it. A clear sign Parliament wanted to supplant them with a new force, loyal only to Parliament. Reece sees the fact this debate even happened as a massive failure of political management by Richard's court.
And the inevitable result of all this escalating tension and mistrust.
The dissolution of Parliament,
Yeah.
which Edward Montagu, a key figure, later called a great and fundamental error.
Others agreed?
Hugh Peter lamented the trampling upon the authority of what he thought was the best Parliament and most freely chosen. Even Richard reportedly knew it was his ruin and resisted it initially.
So Parliament's gone, Richard's authority is collapsing. Where does he look for muscle? His brothers, Monk in Scotland, Henry in Ireland, Lockhart in Dunkirk, they commanded troops.
On paper, yes. They looked like potential pillars of support. Monk, especially, owed his career to the Cromwells, generally seen as loyal. Lockhart wasn't keen on the Rump Parliament that would soon return. Montagu, commanding the fleet, expressed fears and sorrow at the Protectorate's fall.
So why didn't they prop him up?
A combination of things, it seems. Confusion news traveled slowly, events in London were chaotic, communication was poor, then there were their own vulnerabilities, their own ambitions perhaps, and critically, Richard's own passivity. He doesn't seem to have actively rallied them or given them clear direction.
He just didn't act decisively.
Apparently not, so that potential backing just went untapped.
It paints a picture of a leader totally out of his depth. And while historians might try to be more generous now, his contemporaries weren't holding back, were they?
No, they were often brutal. Reece notes that while reappraisal is fair, maybe the rehabilitation has gone far enough. Contemporaries like Nathaniel Fiennes flat out blamed Richard's conduct. Lord Fauconberg scorned his lack of courage. Lucy Hutchinson famously said the job was too big for him, calling him a meek, temperate, and quiet man.
Not the qualities needed right then. So Richard's effectively sidelined, Parliament is dissolved again, the army is back in the driving seat. What are their options now?
The Council of Officers met on April 23rd. They debated three main paths forward. 1. Try to keep governing under the existing humble petition and advice somehow. 2. Recall the Rump Parliament, the one they'd kicked out years before. 3. Try to create some entirely new form of government.
Radical options on the table.
There was even talk of the army just raising money itself without any parliament. Extraordinary. Recalling the Rump wasn't the obvious or most popular choice, though.
Why not?
Lady Ranelagh put it well. The Rump was remembered as much for its failings as its merits. But they needed to act fast.
Why the urgency?
Fear of royalist uprisings flaring up. The likelihood of peace between France and Spain, which could free up foreign powers to intervene. And, fundamentally, no money. Army and Navy finances were collapsing.
So the Rump seemed the quickest, maybe the only viable path to some kind of legitimacy.
It seems that's how they saw it. And as part of that, they quickly agreed to restore commands to officers to Oprisk. Oliver Cromwell had previously removed Lambert, Oakey, Sanders, Packer. a signal of change within the army itself.
And recalling the Rump must have energized the Republican opposition that had been simmering away.
Absolutely. You could see organized opposition brewing from at least February 1658 with that Republican petition.
The one that forced Oliver to dissolve his second parliament.
That's the one. It talked about the good old righteous cause.
Mm.
We don't know exactly who wrote it, but it had prominent radical signatories like Henry Jesse, Hansard Knollys. And it wasn't secret they printed copies, circulated them openly.
How much support did it have?
Josiah Burners claimed 10,000 subscribers, mainly from the separated churches, the independent congregations. They had surprisingly effective networks.
So the Rump returns. What's the reaction across the country? Celebration. Dread.
A real mix. Many were deeply unhappy. William Lawrence called it a dreadful change. Henry Newcomb thought it would be a scourge to the nation. James Sharp noted pamphlets appearing that basically equated Presbyterians and Cavaliers as joint enemies of the Rump. Robert Bailey feared for the established church.
So lots of opposition.
Yes, but interestingly, some royalists were apparently appalled too.
Why? Wouldn't they welcome more chaos?
Because they recognized the Rump, for all its flaws, could govern effectively. They feared it might actually succeed and stabilize things, which would kill off hopes for a quick restoration of the king.
Huh, that's ironic. But despite the mixed welcome, the Rump moved fast to secure its power, especially militarily.
Very fast, very decisively. Monk, up in Scotland, was watching correspondence like a hawk. Across England, they clamped down hard. Hundreds of suspected royalists or potential troublemakers were arrested. Names like Howard, Hollis, Rugg pop up.
And in London.
Full-on military occupation, essentially. Army guards everywhere, militia patrols ramped up, weapon checks, river patrols on the Thames, searches for horses to stop insurgents moving quickly.
They weren't messing around.
Not at all. Even the Inns of Court got searched. Gunsmith shops had their arms secured. Householders had to account for every lodger, every apprentice. Ferry travel was restricted, passes needed. Security got so tight, royalists just had to go to ground. Colonel Barkstead felt confident they had abundantly broken any immediate plots.
And this wasn't just brute force, they were coordinating information too.
Yes, systematically. The Council of State sent regular updates to Monk in Scotland, commissioners in Ireland, Lockhart in Dunkirk, Downing in the Netherlands. Downing got weekly news summaries.
Keeping everyone on message.
And informed. News of Lambert defeating Booth's Rising was spread quickly. Officers in Scotland relayed news to Highland lairds. The council demanded frequent updates for the localities too. Lambert, when campaigning, was sending messengers back to London multiple times a day.
Impressive communication for the time. And just like with Richard, we see petitions being organized, this time in support of the Rump.
We do. And just like before, royalists scoffed, saying they were composed at Westminster, not spontaneous.
Same old story.
And recent research suggests these petitions did share a family likeness in their wording, hinting at central coordination again. The actual scale of support is hard to gauge. You hear figures like many thousands, above 1,000. The only one that survives with actual names from Buckinghamshire has about 800 signatories.
So some organized support, but maybe not a massive popular wave. What about the more radical elements? Were they energized by the Rump's return?
Hugely. You see impressive recruitment for local militias, driven by pure commitment, not pay, a real sense of engagement. And those senior army officers Oliver had purged. They came flooding back, seeking vindication, expecting to get their old commands back.
A sense of restoration for them, too.
And a belief among many radicals that God himself had restored the Rump. People like John Reed in Dorset, George Joyce in London, were active again, pushing for control of the militias to be given only to the faithful. Though there were grumbles that some MPs weren't thorough enough in purging unreliable figures from command.
So despite the challenges, the Rump seemed to have a pretty firm grip initially. The failure of the Royalist risings suggests that.
It does suggest their grip was stronger than perhaps later historians assumed. They could mobilize supporters, they had administrative competence, they had an imposing army, at least initially, and they had constitutional authority, however contested. Effective opposition needed more than just discontent. It needed coordination and legitimacy.
But that army unity, it was always fragile, wasn't it? And it fractures again.
It does. After the army interrupts Parliament again in October 1659, the army leadership tries to blame the Rump for the chaos that follows. But Parliament's supporters hit back, pointing out that army officers actually had a majority on the committee responsible for army appointments, basically saying, you guys are partly responsible for this mess too.
And even within the Rump itself, key figures started pulling in different directions. Heselrigge and Vane.
Yes, they'd worked together initially, But by September 59, clear differences emerged. Loyalty to the Commonwealth ideal, religious toleration, the whole constitutional setup, they disagreed. Vane seemed to favor consensus, trying to avoid a complete break with the army, which he saw as disastrous.
While Heselridge was more confrontational.
Appeared to be. Lord Waristoun recorded trying to talk Vane down, telling him not to take too much offense at the army. It shows the tightrope Vane was walking.
And these divisions were reflected within the army, too. Officers getting removed who had actually supported the Rump's return.
Exactly. Officers like Ashfield and Packer were removed in October, even though they'd backed the Rump. But they'd also promoted petitions criticizing some of Parliament's actions. Packer's a good example. A defender of Parliament, but alienated by hostility towards his fellow officers. He'd opposed Richard Cromwell and publicly repented for it earlier. Complex loyalties all around.
So October 1659, the army dissolves the Rump again. They set up this committee of safety. Did they have a clearer plan this time?
Apparently not. Needham's description of the army in 1653, irresolution and unpreparedness, Reece suggests it applied just as well in 1659. They issued a declaration justifying themselves, but no clear roadmap.
Unlike Cromwell in 53, who set up councils.
Right. Cromwell avoided immediate elections, deemed too risky, set up a council of state and a council of officers. The parallels are limited, though. Monk's presence looms large in 59, and the army arguably had fewer options.
And the leadership within the army, specifically Charles Fleetwood, the commander-in-chief, he seems quite weak in this critical moment.
Fleetwood does seem overwhelmed. He relied heavily on God and Cromwell's legacy, rather than decisive action. He'd been a capable number 2 under Oliver, even disagreed with him sometimes, but he wasn't a natural leader in his own right.
Lacked decisiveness.
And maybe oversight. There's that story about his wife Bridget getting involved with the Derby petition without him seeming fully aware. Clarendon's account paints him as pious, but paralyzed by indecision, as the Committee of Safety crumbled. Ultimately, he failed the people who looked at him for leadership.
While Fleetwood flounders in London, what about Heselridge, the staunch Rumper?
He apparently retreated to his estate, completely in despair of doing anything. He feared raising troops would just help the royalists. He preferred, reluctantly, to close with the army and all their exorbitances rather than risk more division. Even the Rump's own council estate hesitated to act decisively, according to Clarges.
And Monk, still up in Scotland.
Still there, but in a tricky spot by early December. Lambert's army facing him was larger, more experienced. Monk's position looked precarious. Yet somehow, the Rump comes back, and the army's authority just evaporates. Why? Largely, it seems, due to this paralysis of will in the army leadership in London.
Monk must have seemed like a threat to various groups, though.
Oh, definitely. Lambert's troops were probably eager to march into Scotland. The independent churches were very wary of Monk, fearing he'd roll back their freedoms. Royalists, meanwhile, got their hopes up based on some of his statements. Baptists down in Cornwall were complaining about royalists getting too bold. That dread of a royalist restoration actually pushed Monk's own negotiators towards making a deal with the English army.
Interesting. But Fleetwood and Lambert, instead of confronting Monk militarily, tried to accommodate him.
It seems so. Despite efforts by figures like John Owen to sway Monk, they didn't denounce him outright. They allowed Clarges, Monk's man, to travel north and negotiate. It suggests they recognized their own weakness and wanted to avoid an army civil war.
And then comes the game changer, Portsmouth. Heselridge and 2 other dismissed Rump MPs show up there in disguise.
December 3rd, 1659. A massive moment. The governor, Nathaniel Weetham, declares for Parliament. Suddenly, the Rumpers have control of a major port city.
And that tipped the balance.
Decisively. Within 3 weeks, Heselridge marches towards London with about 5,000 soldiers. That, plus the Navy defecting to Parliament's side, just completely broke the Committee of Safety's military government. The officers in London lost their nerve. As Maidstone put it, their wheels fell off. Portsmouth was the occasion that brought us hither back to the Rump.
But did Portsmouth inspire other places to rise up for the Rump?
Not really, no. There were some failed attempts in Kent. A few horsemen fought their way into Portsmouth, but suffered losses. The Rump commissioners were effectively sealed off there. Claims other towns declared for them were mostly false. London's city government stayed neutral.
London staying neutral is key.
Hugely. The commissioners even wrote asking for a safe place in London for MPs to meet, but got silence back. They actually considered moving Parliament to Portsmouth. It shows how isolated they were initially.
And that tension between the Rump and the City of London?
Yeah.
It ran deep, didn't it? The city leadership was often Presbyterian, not keen on the Rump's radicalism.
Exactly. A prickly distance is how Reece describes it. They might cooperate on security against royalists, but fundamentally there was distrust. Flashpoints over the city's rights, customs, and especially Parliament, trying to use London's militia outside London. Parliament backed down on that initially,
But then the Rump provoked them.
by trying to force John Ireton to serve a second year as Lord Mayor. The city united against that, and the Rump had to back down again. A very strained relationship.
But Portsmouth ultimately was enough to break the military government in London.
Yes. The stalemate between Fleetwood and Admiral Lawson's fleet became irrelevant. The final nail was probably Major John Bremen, part of the force besieging Portsmouth for the Committee of Safety, defecting on December 20th.
Another failure of leadership by Fleetwood, allowing potentially mutinous officers like Bremen and Rich to keep commands.
And it looks like negligence, yes. Bremen had a long, radical history going back to 1647. His defection just triggered a wider collapse of the army's will.
So the Rump returns, triumphant, and ready for revenge.
That was the fear, and it seems the reality. John Owen warned Monk a restored Rump would seek retribution. Whereston sensed a judgmental mood. The main target, the army in England that had kicked him out.
A purge.
A big one. Heselrigge, Morley, and Wotton, the heroes of Portsmouth, ratified Monk's purges in his own army and removed officers in England deemed politically suspect based on their actions. Not just intentions, actions.
Harsh.
Very. Officers pleaded for mercy, some in the army argued for forgiveness, but clemency wasn't on the Rump's agenda, according to Ludlow. Many lost commissions just for following orders or having the wrong family connections. Officers were scrambling for powerful patrons, huge turnover, even among those the Rump itself had commissioned just months before. Soldiers ended up under totally unfamiliar officers.
A destabilized army. And meanwhile, Monk is marching south from Scotland. Still unclear what he's really planning.
Very unclear. On January 3rd, he declares he's moving into England because he heard Lambert was marching back to London against Parliament. He gets to York, pauses on January 12th. Was he planning a restoration yet? Probably not definitively.
What did he believe in?
Parliamentary government, it seems, but maybe not this Rump. His instincts were closer to the MPs secluded back in 48, the Presbyterians. He resented attempts to mess with his regiments. He wasn't impressed by the support he'd got from the old Council of State.
So he kept his options open.
Very much so. His instructions for negotiating with the English army included provisions for a new parliament. He told his own troops he wanted a parliament chosen by the people and protected from violence. The speaker's acknowledgement from London was lukewarm. Monk clearly doubted the Rump could settle the nation. He sent his chaplain Gumble to London to suss out the designs and affections of the people in power, while he continued south, slowly.
Taking his time. And while he marches, that call for a free parliament gets louder and louder.
Yes, it had emerged during Booth's Rising, but now gains real momentum. It appealed to lots of people, especially in the Northwest, who just wanted proper parliamentary rule, not necessarily the king back immediately.
Who supported it?
A coalition. Presbyterians, some royalists, united mainly by opposition to the Rump and its interfering army. Those secluded Presbyterian MPs saw their chance to reverse the purge, get back into Parliament, and maybe steer things towards a limited monarchy.
They disliked the Rump more than they distrusted the royalists.
At this point, yes, and the exiled royal court saw the opening. They authorized talks with Presbyterians, hoping free Parliament would become a stepping stone to restoration. Deal with the details later.
But this free parliament movement, Reece suggests it wasn't as powerful or widespread as sometimes portrayed.
Compared to the 1648 movement for a treaty with the king, it seems weaker. Nearly half of English counties produced no declaration for it in 1660. London hesitated, didn't lead, big towns were cautious, magistrates often suppressed demonstrations.
And some of the evidence for support is dodgy.
Yes, some publications claiming support were misleading or false. Petitions with iffy numbers or origins, like from Leicestershire and London. At least 4 supposed county declarations were probably fakes. Propagandists like Roger Lestrange and William Prynne were very active, sometimes using false names, making it hard to gauge genuine feeling.
So Mike is approaching London. The free parliament call is growing, but maybe patchily. How does the Rump react to Monk now?
After Monk's blunt letter of February 11th, they finally realized they had to engage seriously. They started talking about their serious intentions for a full and lasting settlement. The council tried to narrow the gap. They wanted Monk to move his troops to Whitehall, better communication, show unity.
Conciliatory noises.
Lots of them. Efforts to find money for the London regiments. Warm words about restoring the city's rights. Crucially, they dropped that oath of abjuration for council members, the one renouncing the Stuarts. A big concession.
But this reasonableness, it might have worried Monk, things moving too fast towards a settlement he didn't control.
Possibly. He needed to keep control of the pace.
And then the secluded Presbyterian members are readmitted to Parliament in late February. What were their aims? Were they all on the same page?
Impossible to know for sure individually. Some probably genuinely wanted a new, freely elected parliament. Others might have just told Monk that to get back in, planning something else. Each of those 73 MPs meeting Monk on Feb 21st was likely calculating their own best move.
And their return just created more tension within Parliament.
Absolutely. Rumpers like Thomas Scott hated it. And by early March, some of those secluded members were apparently thinking of breaking their deal with Monk and not calling a new parliament, trying to hang on to power themselves.
So the long Parliament might just keep sitting.
That was the fear. Pepys heard talk of a doubtful posture. People wanted to retain power. Rumors flew Monk seizing power, Monk restoring Richard Cromwell, the Long Parliament staying put. The initial welcome for the secluded members turned into suspicion they'd just entrenched themselves.
But Monk wasn't having it. He pushes for dissolution.
He did. He urged them to dissolve and call elections. Pressure mounted. There were reports Monk even discussed his opposition to the late king with the royalist court, probably to reassure Presbyterians. Finally, on March 16, 1660, they voted to dissolve. New parliament to meet April 25th.
A momentous day.
Huge. And before the vote, many MPs rushed to declare Charles I's execution an execrable act, covering their backsides. Robert Reynolds gave a long speech justifying himself. Only Thomas Scott stood by the regicide.
Still some resistance to Monk.
Displeasure that he opposed restoring the House of Lords. They added a clause to the dissolution bill preserving the Lords' rights. And then the so long-lived Parliament finally expired.
And any last gasp of military resistance? Lambert.
His attempt at an insurrection against Monk failed completely. Captured, back in the Tower by Easter Tuesday, April 24th. Almost without a drop of blood. The game was up.
This whole last year of the Republic, Reece emphasizes the incredible confusion, the fog of information. It must have been impossible to know what was really happening.
Terribly difficult. Communication was slow, unreliable. News was manipulated. A contemporary said, "Never was more said and less known." Newspapers complained about the abuse of press freedom, as much impudence as ignorance.
Rumors everywhere.
Constant wild rumors. Richard Cromwell dying, Henry Cromwell lost at sea, Charles Stuart landing here, there, everywhere. James Naylor made governor of Bristol. Even rumors the Rumper commissioners had joined Monk. Each side in the army spun its own version of events. They couldn't even agree how many towns followed Portsmouth's lead.
People didn't trust printed news.
Widespread mistrust. Forgeries, false attributions were common. Fleetwood had to publicly deny saying things attributed to him. Even genuine letters were suspected. Calculated propaganda from Clarges, masked propaganda from the English army. Pamphlets with fake authors, Lestrange and Prynne, were masters of disguise.
And amidst this swirling confusion, a massive military presence everywhere.
Troops were everywhere. Maybe 28,000 regulars by late 1659. Military actions dotted the country, Overton and Hull, the siege of Portsmouth. But whose side were they on? Often unfathomable, like the situation in Taunton.
And restoring civilian government didn't mean fewer soldiers.
Ironically, no. Numbers actually went up to nearly 39,000 by February 1660, which meant heavy billeting, troops taking free quarter, civil disorder aggravated, apprentice riots in Bristol, clashes between civilians and soldiers after Monk's letter, and the MP's return.
So confusion, misinformation, troops everywhere with unclear loyalties. No wonder people felt passive, afraid to act.
Exactly. Civilians were in a fear to act anything. Political passivity set in among politicians, too. Lenthal reluctant to take his seat as Speaker. MPs developing convenient illnesses. Even Lucy Hutchinson wanted out of partisan politics. Sir John Bennet just pleaded to be left alone to live quietly.
And public reactions to all this. Pepys famously describes London going wild with joy when Monk declared for a free parliament.
Yes, bonfires and bell ringing in London. But outside the capital, reactions seem much more mixed, more cautious. Manchester was careful about lighting bonfires.
What were the main priorities for most people, especially the propertied classes?
Order, stability, and getting rid of the huge financial burden of the army. Leicester asked Monk to avoid the town and refused to back the county petition for a free parliament. Many places suppressed disorders related to the free parliament calls. Maintaining order was paramount, even for some royalists.
So beneath all the political maneuvering, the dominant mood was just this deep desire for settlement.
Yeah.
Any settlement.
That seems to be the core issue. the want of a real, settled, and regular government, the constant fear of the nation being still upon the cast of a die. John Evelyn lamented being no closer to settlement after 10 years. People complained constantly about the rapid changes, the uncertainty. Even army officers hated the tottering state.
Which leads to this pragmatic acceptance of the Restoration, even if people weren't enthusiastic monarchists.
Yes, many just accepted the need to accommodate the likely return of the monarchy as the best way to get stability. Though, as Reece notes, those who made shameless last-minute conversions got scorned. Luke Robinson is a prime example. John Lawson, the admiral, faced later condemnation for his shifts. Richard Inglesby, the regicide, suddenly couldn't remember signing the death warrant.
Convenient memory loss, and we see all these individuals who'd been major players trying to navigate this treacherous transition, some successfully, some not.
Mansell and Montague were unusual in approaching the royal court relatively early. It's interesting others with known royalist links waited so long. Anthony Ashley Cooper, later Shaftesbury, had a very complex path before finally opposing the Committee of Safety. Lord Brokehill, always well-connected, eventually backed the Restoration. George Downing navigated brilliantly, if ruthlessly, betraying former colleagues to thrive under Charles II.
And others weren't so lucky or perhaps so adaptable.
Colonel John Oakey, whose allegiances shifted, ended up executed as a regicide. Colonel John Hewson fled into exile despite naive protests of loyalty. Sir Archibald Johnston of Wurriston, the opportunist, met a tragic end. Bulstrode Whitelocke tried hard, but his comparison of Monk to Booth was disastrous. Edmund Ludlow, the staunch Republican, saw reconciliation attempts fail as his anxiety grew.
It really highlights the personal dramas within the grand political shifts. Looking back, could things have gone differently? Could the Protectorate or the restored Rump have survived?
Reece suggests both could potentially have survived. The key rupture, the point of no return perhaps, was that break between the army and Parliament in October 1659. That made the Republic's fall a real possibility. After that, restraint and conciliation just became rarer and rarer.
Even if Heselridge had been more politically astute.
A lasting parliamentary alliance was always unlikely, Reece argues, but perhaps, just perhaps, a more skillful handling of Monk by the Republicans might have delayed the Republic's fall, though it might also have made the end more violent.
A sobering thought. Thank you for walking us through that incredibly complex and dramatic year. It really is a deep dive into the mechanics of political collapse and transition.
It's a period that reveals so much about power, fear, and the fundamental human need for order.
Absolutely. For everyone listening, what stood out to you most about this period? Was there a particular moment or figure that surprised you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your takeaways.
And what questions do you still have? About Richard Cromwell, Monk's motivations, the Rump's failures? Keep the conversation going.
Definitely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Reflecting on these events from over 350 years ago, in our own world, which often feels saturated with information and buffeted by political shifts, how do we tell the difference between genuine stability and just a temporary quiet before the next upheaval?
That's the enduring question, isn't it? The events of 1659 offer a compelling historical lens to think about that. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.